Imagine you're there in 1986, bundled up against that Florida cold, watching the Space Shuttle Challenger on the launch pad, ready to go up. It's such a, moment of national pride, right? The culmination of years of work and dreams. But then just 73 seconds after liftoff, that dream turns into a nightmare. And so today, we're going to dive deep into the Challenger disaster, and we're going to use excerpts from the American Scandal podcast to kind of uncover all the decisions and the events that led up to this tragedy.
It is fascinating how beneath the surface of this really celebrated event, there was this kind of simmering tension brewing. It's a story of technical concerns and mounting pressure, and ultimately a failure to heed the warnings.
Yeah, absolutely. It really wasn't just a technical malfunction, right? It was this complex interplay of human decisions and systemic pressures. And then this one tiny component, this simple O-ring, played like a surprisingly crucial role.
These O-rings, they're seemingly insignificant rubber seals. They were really the key to containing the immense pressure and heat that was generated during launch. It was the thin line between a successful mission and catastrophe.
Yeah, it's incredible. Now, the podcast mentions that engineers had noticed issues with these O-rings years before Challenger. So what kind of problems were they seeing, and did anyone raise any concerns?
Okay, so imagine those massive white solid rocket boosters that are strapped to the shuttle. Each booster is made of segments that are bolted together, and those O-rings are the seals between those segments. As early as 1982, engineers were finding evidence of scorching and erosion on the O-rings after some launches. Hot gases were escaping, and it posed a risk to the entire mission. An engineer named Roger Boisjoli, he worked at Morton Thiokol, that's the company that made the boosters. He was particularly vocal about these issues. He really dedicated himself to understanding why these O-rings were failing.
So these weren't just minor glitches. These were red flags signaling a potentially catastrophic problem.
Yes.
What did Boisjoli's research reveal about the cause of these O-ring failures?
Well, his research uncovered a chilling correlation. The colder the temperature, the less flexible the O-ring material became, and that compromised its ability to seal effectively. And as fate would have it, the forecast for the Challenger launch predicted unusually cold temperatures, far below what anyone was comfortable with given what they knew about the O-rings.
So we have a known design flaw. We have increasingly urgent warnings.
Yeah.
And then a launch is scheduled in conditions that are known to make the problem worse. This is starting to feel like a slow-motion train wreck.
Precisely. And the situation escalated dramatically the night before the launch. During this very tense teleconference between Thiokol engineers and NASA officials, picture this late-night scramble to determine if it was even safe to proceed with the launch.
Wow. So you've got engineers who are deeply concerned about the O-rings in the cold weather. And on the other side, you've got NASA management, who are facing immense pressure to keep this highly publicized mission on schedule. It sounds like a real clash of priorities.
Exactly. And remember, this wasn't just any mission. Krista McAuliffe, the first teacher in space, was on board, making this a media sensation. The eyes of the world were on NASA.
Yeah. So you've got this pressure cooker situation. And to make matters worse, the engineers didn't have perfectly conclusive data. They had strong correlations, but not absolute proof that the O-rings would definitely fail at these predicted temperatures. So did they err on the side of caution and postpone the launch?
Initially, Thiokol's engineers, led by Boisjoli, they did recommend delaying the launch until warmer temperatures. They even proposed a specific minimum temperature for safe operation, but that's when the story takes a heartbreaking turn.
Okay, so if the engineers recommended a delay, why on earth did the Challenger launch anyway? Was there new information?
No, it wasn't new information. It was pressure. Remember, NASA had a lot riding on this launch. Delays, especially after a previous postponement, meant negative press, potential funding cuts, and a blow to national pride. They pushed back hard against the engineers' recommendation.
Wow. So did Thiokol stand their ground? Did they hold firm on their recommendation for a delay?
Sadly, no. Despite the engineers' objections, Thiokol's management ultimately caved to the pressure from NASA. They reversed their initial recommendation and gave the green light for the launch.
Wait, their own management overruled their engineers. Why? What could have possibly led them to such a risky decision?
We have to think about it from their perspective. Thiokol was a contractor. They were heavily reliant on NASA contracts. Pushing back too hard risked damaging their relationship and their future business. It was a classic case of business interests tragically trumping safety concerns.
It's unbelievable. So despite all the warning signs, the launch was a go. So what happened next? Did anyone else voice concerns as launch day approached?
Well, the podcast paints a vivid picture of launch day. It was freezing at Cape Canaveral, with ice literally covering the launch pad and the shuttle itself. Charlie Stevenson, a NASA ice team leader, was stunned by the amount of ice, and he even voiced concerns that falling ice could damage the shuttle during liftoff.
So even on the morning of the launch, there were still glaring signs that things weren't right. It sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Exactly, and all this while, the astronauts, including Krista McAuliffe, were preparing for their mission, unaware of the intense debate and worries surrounding the very vehicle that was about to carry them into space.
Yeah. It's hard to fathom the courage and the trust those astronauts must have had, especially given the mounting concerns about the launch. Did anyone else besides the ICE team express any last-minute reservations?
The podcast highlights that Rockwell, the company that built the orbiter, also voiced concerns about the unprecedented cold conditions. And even Commander Dick Scobie expressed surprise at the decision to launch, given the weather.
Wow, so there was dissent even among those directly involved in the mission. It seems everyone from the engineers to the launch pad crew had a bad feeling about this launch.
And that's what makes this story so haunting and so relevant even today. It underscores the importance of speaking up, of voicing those concerns, even when those in positions of power seem determined to push forward regardless of the risks.
It's a chilling reminder that sometimes the most important voices are those who dare to dissent.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder, what was going through those astronauts' minds, especially Krista McAuliffe. She was carrying the hopes and dreams of so many people. Did any of them suspect something might be wrong?
Well, it's impossible to know for sure, but the podcast does hint that some of them may have had reservations. It mentions Scobie's initial surprise at the decision to launch in such cold weather. And remember, Rockwell, the company that built the orbiter itself, also expressed concerns about those unprecedented conditions.
So even among those who were about to strap themselves into this rocket, there were doubts. But I imagine the culture at NASA, the training, the trust in the system, all of that might make it hard to voice those doubts too loudly.
Absolutely. These were highly trained professionals used to following orders and trusting the judgment of their superiors. And it's likely they believed that if there were any truly serious concerns, the launch would have been scrubbed without question. Yeah. It's just heartbreaking. The loss of life, the shattered dreams, the erosion of public trust in NASA. The impact of this disaster was enormous.
And the Challenger disaster had a profound impact on the space program itself. It led to a lengthy grounding of the shuttle fleet, a complete overhaul of safety procedures, and a reassessment of how NASA managed risk.
Right. Let's go back to that fateful morning. The podcast paints a very vivid picture of the launch itself. The crowds gathered at Cape Canaveral, millions watching on TV across the country. This was a major media event.
And it's crucial to remember the historical context here. The Challenger launch with Krista McAuliffe on board had captured the public's imagination like never before. Families were watching, school children were gathered in auditoriums. Everyone was captivated by the promise of space exploration.
Yeah. And then just 73 seconds after liftoff, the unthinkable happened.
The world watched in horror as the Challenger broke apart, transforming from a symbol of hope and progress into this devastating reminder of the fragility of human endeavor.
It's hard to even imagine. The podcast describes the reaction back at Thiokol. Where the engineers who had warned about the O-rings were watching the launch, it must have been absolutely gut-wrenching for them knowing they had tried to prevent this tragedy.
Roger Boisjoli, in particular, was deeply affected. The podcast describes him leaving the room, unable to bear witness to the unfolding disaster. He later said that in his heart, he knew the O-rings were to blame.
Imagine carrying that burden, knowing that you tried to warn everyone but ultimately couldn't prevent this catastrophe. It's a powerful image of the human cost of this failure.
And the story doesn't end there. In the aftermath of the disaster, Boisjoli became a key figure, driven by this determination to ensure the truth came out, even if it meant going against his own company.
So he became a whistleblower.
In a sense, yes. The podcast describes how Boisjoli began to suspect a cover-up, both by NASA and Thiokol as they tried to downplay the role of the O-rings in the disaster. He secretly preserved key documents, evidence that would later prove crucial in exposing the systemic failures that led to the tragedy.
It's a reminder that sometimes doing the right thing means challenging authority, speaking truth to power, even when it carries personal risks.
Boisjoli's actions were courageous, but they came at a cost. He faced backlash from his company. He was ostracized by colleagues and suffered emotional distress from the weight of his knowledge and the attacks that he endured.
It's a stark reminder that whistleblowers often face significant challenges, both professionally and personally. But their willingness to speak up, even in the face of adversity, is crucial for accountability and preventing future tragedies.
And in the case of the Challenger disaster, Boisjoli's testimony, along with the evidence that he preserved, played a critical role in revealing the truth and forcing NASA to confront its shortcomings.
So as the dust settled, what happened next? How did NASA and the country grapple with this tragedy?
There was a sense of shock and disbelief, both at NASA and across the country. It's hard to overstate the impact of this event. It was a national trauma, broadcast live into living rooms and classrooms.
Yeah. And then there were the families of the astronauts, waiting for news, clinging to hope, only to have their worst fears confirmed.
The podcast takes us inside those heart-wrenching moments. The families gathering at a NASA facility, the agonizing wait for information, and then the devastating realization that their loved ones were gone.
It's just unimaginable. The pain and grief they must have experienced, the sudden loss, the public scrutiny, the knowledge that this tragedy could have been prevented. It's a wound that must have taken a very long time to heal.
As the nation mourned, the focus shifted to the investigation. The question on everyone's mind was what went wrong, who was responsible, and how do we prevent such a disaster from ever happening again?
And I imagine that investigation was incredibly complex, with political pressures, bureaucratic maneuvering, and attempts to shield individuals and institutions from blame.
Absolutely. It's a classic example of how organizations, even those with noble goals and extraordinary achievements, can become vulnerable to systemic failures, groupthink, and the prioritization of image over safety.
Yeah. This deep dive into the Challenger disaster has been both fascinating and incredibly sobering. It's a story about human fallibility, the allure of ambition, and the importance of dissenting voices, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable pressure.
Yeah, it really makes you think about, the human element in all of this,
Yeah.
the ambition,
Yeah.
the pressure to succeed, the fear of speaking up. Even with all of our technological advancements, it often comes down to human choices and the consequences of those choices.
You're absolutely right. That's precisely what makes the Challenger story so enduringly relevant. It serves as a stark reminder that even in the pursuit of scientific progress and national pride, we must never lose sight of the human cost of our decisions.
It's a lot to absorb, for sure.
Yeah.
So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive,
Yep.
what would you say is the single biggest takeaway from all of this? What's the lesson, even decades later, that we should carry with us? Well, I believe the most enduring lesson of Challenger lies in the importance of dissenting voices. We see how engineers, despite their concerns, ultimately failed to effectively communicate the risks to those in power. Whether due to hierarchical structures or pressure to conform or fear of repercussions, their warnings went unheeded.
That's a crucial point. But how does this translate to our own lives and our work? Most of us aren't designing rockets or making life or death decisions.
True, but the underlying principles apply to all of us. Think about a time you had a concern at work, maybe about a project or a decision, but felt hesitant to speak up. Maybe you didn't want to rock the boat, or you thought your opinion wouldn't matter.
Or maybe you thought, hey, I'm just an engineer, or, fill in the blank with your job. What do I know about management decisions?
Exactly. But here's the thing, your perspective matters. You might have information or insights that others don't. And by speaking up, by asking questions, by challenging assumptions, you might just prevent a small problem from snowballing into a major disaster.
So it's about finding the courage to raise those concerns, even when it feels uncomfortable.
Precisely. And it's also about fostering a culture where those voices are heard and respected, where dissent is seen not as disloyalty, but as a valuable form of feedback.
The Challenger disaster is a powerful reminder that technology, while amazing, is only as good as the humans behind it. It's up to us to make wise and ethical choices, to speak up when we see something wrong, and to create environments where those voices are not only heard but valued.
It's a lesson that resonates far beyond the realm of space exploration, touching on the very core of how we function as individuals, as teams, and as societies.
This deep dive has been incredibly insightful, a sobering reminder of the importance of learning from the past and carrying those lessons forward.
I agree. The Challenger disaster, while tragic, offers us a valuable opportunity to reflect on our own choices and actions, and to strive to create a world where safety, accountability, and the courage to speak truth to power are paramount.
And on that note, we wrap up our deep dive into the Challenger disaster. If you found this exploration thought-provoking, be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into fascinating and sometimes challenging topics. We'll continue to bring you the knowledge and context you need to understand the world around us, one deep dive at a time.